Okay, so I'm gonna see if I can get this thing actually working. Um, let's see. So I'll share this. Share this so I can find it. That's not what I'm looking for. That is the terrible live stream. This is still the new stream. Here is what I'm looking for, your channel. Okay. Let's go here. Here's the link. Okay, is there anyone else here besides me? Okay, so we got one other person here. Okay, so at least something's working. All right, so I thought I'd talk a little about kind of my approach and how I think about the step one. I guess since there's one other person here right now, I'm happy also to answer any questions people have. But generally, like my point with the Reddit post was, um, most of us, throughout college and through medical school, we're tested on knowledge. So you're asked to really, you memorize these facts, you regurgitate it back. There's not a whole lot of practice with figuring out how to actually take that knowledge and apply it. And the step one is really a different beast in that sense. The step one not only asks you to have a really significant knowledge base, but also figure out how to apply that knowledge. And also reason through questions through facts that you've maybe never seen before. So basically, I think one problem a lot of students tend to fall into is they're very used to sort of memorizing facts. And they expect the exam to basically test them on facts. What I think you guys should really kind of prepare yourselves for is that there are going to be facts and items on the exam that you've never seen. And so what that means, because there's just so much to know, there's no way to sort of learn it all. It's honestly impossible. So what that means is you have to have ways to sort of reason your way through these questions and through these items that you haven't seen. So if you start looking at your studying from that kind of perspective, that, okay, I can't learn all these facts, and there are going to be exam items that I haven't seen on UWorld or aren't even really similar to what I've seen on UWorld, and there's going to be things that are just sort of thrown at me. How do I sort of manage my studying? How do I kind of approach it from that perspective? And feel free to comment on the chat as well. I'll kind of help guide the conversation. So kind of how I kind of break things down is, rather than focusing just on knowledge and facts and kind of memorizing as much as you can for first aid, the goal is really content integration. And that's kind of the first goal. The other kind of prong is problem solving. How do you approach problems where you get down to two and you're like, what the heck do I do? How do you sort of reason under uncertainty? That's really the goal of this. So content integration I look at as kind of consisting of two parts. One is, you kind of take, at least in terms of scheduling, what I recommend doing is start with kind of a general subject in the morning. So something like biochem or pathology. And then in the afternoon, evening, the idea is you're applying the concepts you learn there to stuff that's more specific. So your organ system based stuff. Questions about this so far? Okay, so this is a little bit of an experiment for me as well. So hopefully you can just bear with it. Now, what I think probably the best way to sort of illustrate this is actually through maybe a little bit of teaching. Honestly, that's probably what I'm better at than just kind of giving vague principles. Um, so let me take as an example cardiology and how I think about cardiology. Um, so when I think about cardiology, rather than just opening up first aid, starting with the physiology and trying to break things down, where I start is with heart failure. Because I know at the end of the day, every single pathology that I learn about, whether it's arrhythmias or valve disease or acute coronary syndromes, all of them ultimately lead to heart failure. And so if I have a good understanding of heart failure, then I really can get a sense. I really, basically, my point is you have to start with heart failure. And if you have a good understanding of heart failure, then you can kind of move on to your acute coronary syndromes, your valve diseases, et cetera. So you're sort of organizing things around almost like a concept map centered around heart failure. So again, it's the way you organize knowledge is just as important as what you know. As an example, like all of us learn, a mean arterial pressure is equal to total peripheral resistance. Let me see this question. So thoughts on foregoing board videos? So I don't think I think one problem, questions are really helpful, by the way. So I think one problem is people look at this as a very binary sort of decision, like, oh, I can only use this or I can only use that. The way I kind of look at things is instead of focusing on a single sort of text or question bank, what you're really trying to do is learn concepts. So the goal is to figure out where the concepts are. So if the concepts are in the board videos, well, use the board videos. If the concepts are in the question banks, go to the question banks. So there's not any one thing that I say is better than the others. What you consistently have to do is questions. The more questions you do, and the more thoughtful you are about the way you do questions, the better you're going to do. I do tend to recommend Sketchy Micro and Sketchy Farm, mainly because you're at a disadvantage if other people use them, and it's kind of just a nice way to see how that material is presented. But for both Farm and Micro, it's really kind of the first level. Like once you know that information, like essentially what you've been presented is, okay, I have all my bugs, and I know all the things that they do. But I think when you're really starting to think about 240 plus type scores, you need to start being able to go from patient presentations to all the different bugs that can cause those patient presentations. So like take say pneumonia. I need to understand all the different types of community acquired pneumonia that are there. I need to understand ventilator associated pneumonias. And that is not so much in Sketchy. But I think as kind of developing a foundation, start with Sketchy. For Boards and Beyond and DIT, I'm not quite as familiar with those videos. I know they're super, super detailed. And that detail can be good. It can also not be necessary. So if you feel pretty confident in your foundations, I don't think Boards and Beyond is necessary. I don't think that level of detail is necessary. If you're feeling pretty shaky, I would recommend taking a look back at it. I'm actually not familiar with Crush Step 1, but first aid is a foundation. Like first aid, you should always be referring back to. And what are my thoughts? Okay, so it seems like Anki is something that's hopefully, Jeffrey, that answers your question. It's kind of a lengthy way to answer it. So in terms of Anki, I know I've had some new students who are beginning to use Anki, And here's the issue. I have students who come to me and say, should I choose between doing 10,000 cards or doing 26,000 cards? To me, I never used flashcards, and those resources weren't available at that time when I took the exam. But going through 10,000 flashcards or 26,000 flashcards just sounds crazy to me. I mean, maybe it's possible, and I think it might be a way to enhance your learning. But honestly, what's more important than anything is rather than 10,000 flashcards, if you can do 10,000 questions, you're going to be in a much kind of better position. I think in terms of like maybe the farm or the micro, it may be kind of reasonable to consider doing that. I think just like it goes back to that idea that people who do well studying with Anki already know how to apply the knowledge. I have a lot of students who are really not able to do that. They're not able to go from knowledge to knowledge application simply by memorizing stuff. And so a lot of my advice is partially to those students. And it's so if something's working for you, stick with it. You really kind of have to experiment around a little bit. And that's also partly why I recommend, like, you'll have your dedicated, but maybe a month before dedicated, start really thinking about these things and try some different kind of tactics. Other questions for me. I'm like, it's much more helpful to have questions. I mean, things I can do in the future are definitely along the lines of like maybe like talking through questions, things like that. But in general, when I think about how to sort of work through QBanks, and again, people feel totally free to disagree with me. I really think the way to approach them. Well, let me actually answer questions. I'm going to focus on questions. In the last week or 2 weeks before STEP, what do you recommend to do? So it really depends where you're at. So if you've been consistently getting 250s, 260s on your PES exams, there's honestly not a ton to do. I'd say in general, like what to really focus on is like small details at this point. So when you're 6, 8, 10 weeks, you're really focusing on concepts. But when you're a week or 2 weeks out, you need to learn like the little specific nitpicky things that they might ask, because you'll lose points if you miss them. That's where like Anki, that's where memorization can really kind of help. So I'm thinking about like side effects of anti-epileptics. I'm thinking about like the different HIV drugs and their side effects. Like it's super random. There's not a good way to rationalize a lot of it. So you kind of gotta memorize it. And that's what I'd spend the last 2 weeks really focusing on. Questions become a little less important. But one thing I do want to point out is consistency in NBME scores is more important than anything else. So, people will tell me, okay, I got a 230 and then I got a 210 and then I got a 240 and then I got a 190. That's kind of an issue. I feel much better about a student who gets consistent 230s. For example. So that would be my recommendation for kind of the last 2 weeks is really focus on those nitpicky details. So, well, when I think about retaining things, I think the idea is early in your studying, you're really focusing on concepts, and you're focusing on why questions, and just doing tons and tons and tons of QBank questions as well. Throughout that period of time, you can be doing Anki flashcards. You can be doing Sketchy Farm. You can do Sketchy Micro. I mean, you can spend 2 hours a day doing that and get these, the stupid little nitpicky details into your head. And not only will that help you kind of really ingrain the concepts, but it'll also help you learn the details too. I think something that I found really helpful for me was, and a lot of people disagree with me on this, is actually studying with other people and talking about the material. I think there's really no better way to really think through the material than to talk about it. So if I'm always talking about, let's say azithromycin or like using these concepts, they'll get into your head much quicker. So that's and that's actually how you can. But my point is, you can really use spaced repetition this way by just integrating it regularly into your studying. Not the only way you're doing studying, but do an hour and a half of flashcards a day or every other day. But do it focused. So focus on a specific organ system, and then what you should intentionally do is figure out how you can connect it back to the concept that you learned that day. So let's say you're learning about azithromycin. Well, things I might ask about azithromycin is, we know it's a protein synthesis inhibitor. Can we think about other protein synthesis inhibitors? Could we think about, well, if we have protein synthesis inhibitors, why might that be useful for bacteria that produce toxins? So those are some questions that kind of can start integrating things together. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay. So other questions, feel free to ask me. Otherwise, let's see. Should I begin Q banks in general? So I think one problem that I see people run into is they believe they have to start the Q banks. They believe they have to start the Q banks when they have like this perfect knowledge, and so they have to study, and they study and study and study, and they have to get this perfect foundation, and then only then can they start the Q banks. Here's the deal: the Q banks are a learning tool, and so that's why I say it's totally okay sometimes to have like first aid open, to do untimed, tutor mode, organ system focused. It is a learning tool. It's not an assessment tool. NBMEs are for assessment. What I recommend doing is maybe every other day, do like a serious sit down, 40 question randomized assessment. But otherwise, you should be viewing these questions as a learning tool. The other piece of things is, people will always tell me they're taking notes and they're annotating first aid with the questions from UWorld. And people are kind of almost trying to memorize the questions from UWorld. What I want you guys to focus on, what you guys should really be focusing on, is trying to take away the concept. So what is the concept that they're testing me on? And when you're looking at a question, was it an issue with reasoning? Or is it an issue with, when you miss a question, for example, was it an issue with reasoning? Or was it an issue with a fact you didn't know? If it's a fact you don't know, honestly, I'm not that concerned about it. You can always go look up that fact. But if it's an issue with reasoning, or the way you or if you misread the question, that is something to work on. That's really something to think about. So one thing that I think can be really helpful is, you should assume every single question on this exam is testing a concept, and that concept is from first aid. It's buried in first aid. And so what you have to do a lot of the time is figure out, how do I go from this relatively opaque question to translating it to the easier to understand concept in first aid. And if you can do that, and if you can do that consistently, you'll get the question right. So a great way to test yourself is to say, okay, how would I phrase this question in terms of kind of what the concept is in first aid? Now let me look at this other question. I just took NBME 18 for a baseline, got a 182. Looking over it, I realized that the majority of the questions I missed were right in first aid, but I couldn't remember the deals. Would flashcards help? So really the question is why you're missing. Is it details you're missing, or is it concepts that you're missing? Is it issues with reasoning? So oftentimes students will know all the details. Like if I press them a little bit, they'll tell me the details, but they're not knowing how to apply those details. And that's my concern with flashcards, is you could write flashcards that really test you on the reasoning. But if you're kind of just doing kind of the same thing, it's I don't know how much it's going to help. So as an example, all of us learn that if you drop total peripheral resistance, cardiac output will increase. So you could learn that, but let's say you have a question. Let's say you have a question that asks you why. What is the connection that allows cardiac output to increase when total peripheral resistance drops? This is the sort of thing I think people kind of miss in their studying. Is first aid will say this is that, like, kind of this one thing. It is an exam about mechanisms to some extent. There is real pure memorization on it too. I don't want to deny that. There really is pure memorization on it. But understanding the mechanisms provides a foundation to kind of add on to that pure memorization. Hopefully that answered your question. I don't know if that helped. I think trying flashcards isn't a bad idea. I think it's really something to consider. But overall, I would focus more on first figuring out what you actually missed. Was it concepts? Was it reasoning? Now, let's see. During M2, did I go to lecture and focus on in-class material and STEM material? So I actually skipped almost all my lectures M2 year, to be totally honest with you. I hated the way the curriculum was organized. I hated the memorization. Like, what I said to myself is, okay, I'm gonna do the stuff I'm interested in. I'm gonna focus on the stuff I'm interested in. And so like I got B's in micro because, like, the thing is, you're eventually gonna learn micro. Like, there's no point for me memorizing like these really, really kind of specific things. Like, I'll learn them. So what I did instead was I focused on stuff I was interested in, and so which was mainly cardio, pulm, and renal. And it turned out that really having like a good foundation in that helps a hell of a lot for the exam. Now, in terms of the way I actually study for the exam itself, I don't recommend doing this. I didn't use first aid, which is kind of crazy. I don't recommend doing that. But I used a lot of in-class material, and I did a lot of like just read a lot of Medscape, and I just did a ton of questions. I did both the Kaplan Q Bank and about and most of the UWorld Q Bank. One thing I want to say about that is a lot of people will say, you need to do the UWorld Q Bank twice. I don't recommend that. I didn't, which is kind of insane. Don't do that. I didn't use first aid for step one. That's I had it. That it was crazy that I didn't. And the last like week before my exam, I freaked out and realized that I really should have. But it was kind of a wash at the end of the day. But with all my students I work with now, I do use first aid, and it's absolutely essential. Okay, so let me try and address some of these questions one at a time. Okay, I'm not familiar with UFAPS. I have to learn a little more about it. Kaplan, I don't know about Kaplan materials other than their QBank. I actually think it's pretty good. Oh, okay, that's what it is. That's what people call it. Yeah, I think that's totally fine. I would recommend that. Yeah, the thing is, like, you should, if you don't understand the concept, or you don't understand, like, if something's not connecting, don't just stick to that material. Like, a lot of students will stick to that material. Go online, go figure it out, go on UpToDate. Like, you can kind of wade into a lot of details there, but it can at least give you another perspective. And I think looking at a single subject from multiple perspectives can be really helpful. So yeah, I think it's a pretty good basis. Rather than doing UWorld twice, I would recommend doing a different QBank. So I would do UWorld and then I would do Kaplan. or I would kind of mix them up throughout your studying. So like the way I looked at it was, okay, UWorld is really close to the exam. It's high quality. I will use Kaplan to do more organ focused studying. So like let's say I don't really understand dermatology. I'll do all the dermatology questions in Kaplan. And then I'll go back to more like my regular 40 randomized in first aid, or not first aid, in UWorld. So that's kind of how I would kind of approach using kind of multiple Q banks. Let's see, and that's kind of my thoughts on at least the Kaplan Q bank. Okay, we take step one after a year of clerkships and BME shelf exams. What specific recommendations do you have in this context? I think in a lot of ways you're going to be much more prepared. I think. I mean, I think in terms of I can totally understand like the issue learning the basic sciences, like all of that stuff. Um, what I would say is like that's the sort of thing where you can sit down with a friend, and it can be super super useful to kind of just like talk that out, like spend 6-7 hours just talking some of that out. And because you've learned it in the past, it'll come back. The other thing that I can think be nice is use the Q banks to just refamiliarize yourself with the material. So just do 40 questions on, molecular genetics. So if you do 40 questions on molecular genetics, it'll kind of remind you what's going on. And then they might feel a little less resistance to doing that. At least that's kind of what worked for me in the past. But I totally like understand what you're saying. So how was I able to retain all the info in all those Q banks? I've heard friends say that retaining all of UWorld is very difficult as it is. So I didn't look at it as trying to retain the Q banks, right? Because the NBMEs are not the Q banks. The thing about UWorld is it still uses a lot of buzzwords, and there aren't really buzzwords anymore on the real step exam. You have to actually understand what the buzzwords are saying. And I want to emphasize this. People will say buzzwords, always pay attention to the buzzword. The problem with that is it kind of encourages a tendency for students to look for one kind of piece of information that to kind of guide them through the question. A buzzword, like kind of a key phrase, like kind of a key phrase that would sort of lead someone to the answer. The problem with that is most of these questions require kind of a whole view. You kind of have to get a whole perspective on this to sort of see what's going on. You have to use all the pieces of information, get a kind of a whole picture, and then reason from that. So it's not that I was retaining all the info from the Q banks. I wasn't trying to memorize the Q banks. What I was doing was I was trying to build almost just like kind of general kind of a feel for the concepts through the question banks. So let's say I missed a question on, I don't know, stress incontinence. Well, instead of just looking at stress incontinence, if I didn't feel super comfortable with urinary incontinence in general, I'd use that as an excuse to go review everything I knew about urinary incontinence. So what I do when I was reviewing questions is, let's say there was a concept or some memorized fact I didn't know. Well, then I go back and I use that as an excuse to review a lot of that. Just kind of that whole concept. Does that make sense? Like the goal is not to retain, kind of all the material. The goal is to take away tools to be able to apply to new questions. Because if you just try and memorize the Q bank, it's not going to go so well. Other questions for me? Yeah, that's something I work on a lot with students. And I'll get to your question, Jose. Just let me. I'm gonna answer the Pujan's first. So basically, what you have to do, or what I recommend doing, this is going to be a little bit of a, may not be a satisfying response. So what I recommend people do is look for 2 to 3 pieces of evidence in the question that supports your answer, between the two. So the reason I say 2 to 3 is because it's easy to find one piece of evidence that supports whatever, kind of crackpot hypothesis that we might have. I say no more than 3 because there's tons of information there. You have to do some weeding out. You have to figure out what is the key information. And I think that can help a lot of the time, narrowing down when you have two answer choices. The other piece is making sure that the other piece of information is making sure that when you kind of break a question into, you have the question, or the question stem, you have the question itself, then you have the answers. Read through the whole thing before you actually start really thinking about what the answer is. Read the answers. Use the answers as a way to help you answer the question. Don't just sit there, ignore the answers, try and figure out the question, and then try and find whatever you figured out in the multiple choice questions, the multiple choice answers. Use the answers to help inform you. Things that can help: cluster things together that are similar. So oftentimes what you'll see is, you'll find that, let's say someone has, I don't know, a TSH secreting pituitary adenoma, and there's 2 answer choices in terms of elevated, like they say, like, okay, what's decreased here, what's elevated here. If they say both TSH and T3, those can't be answer choices. I mean, even though that ostensibly that's the answer, like if there's multiple things that like follow from one another, or would both be increased when it's a question that's asking about, something that's increasing or decreasing, well, that can't be the answer. When I don't understand what the question is really getting at, I rule out. I think ruling out can be a super, super useful tool. Get comfortable with feeling like you're making educated guesses. You're going to feel that way. Another thing is, when people are really uncertain, they'll have a tendency to go back, revisit their answer, and change it just because they're feeling uncertain. Don't do that. Like, you have to have a damn good reason to change your answer. That's kind of my opinion. You really have to have a good reason to change your answer. Excuse me. So hopefully that answers your question partially. Like that's kind of a more involved discussion. And probably having some actual questions in front of me would be helpful. Now, in terms of your question, Jose, so every NBME has different names. Which one should be the one I use first? I don't think it really matters. I think any of them is fine. I really like the new NBMEs. I think the new NBMEs are very, very, very similar to what the real thing felt like. At least what I've looked through with students. There's just a level of kind of like uncertainness in the question that I don't think UWorld captures. And that uncertainty, I think, is kind of what I'm trying to speak to, because it's so, like, if you can, it would be really helpful to start with one of the newer NBMEs, like maybe NBME 20, 21, because I was very impressed with those exams and how much they felt like the real thing. That would be my recommendation. Can you comment on why? Okay, hold on. Actually, what resource would you recommend to go back and really learn concepts, since FA probably isn't the best for that? So, this is probably vaguer advice. So kind of with that, I use the internet a ton. And I used a bunch of different textbooks. I don't necessarily, again, I don't necessarily recommend doing this. I would use Medscape. I probably spent a little too much time than needed digging into the questions. But I also couldn't find anyone who wanted to like really study together either during this time because everyone was freaking out. And that's really how I tend to learn best, is kind of by talking through things. So I used kind of a mix of, like, our school had printed out, like, just throughout the year we gotten kind of these texts with information, and I used those texts and as probably a primary source. Um, and Yeah, that's probably not the best. I don't know if I'd recommend people to do that. But what I do is, you take what I would say is start with first aid, and when you see a concept, when they're linking an association, when they're making an association, ask yourself, why does this association make sense? So, as an example, they'll talk about how curling ulcers, um, they'll talk about curling ulcers being caused by burns. So, curling ulcers are not just caused by burns. So you should ask yourself, okay, well, why are they saying that curling ulcers are caused by burns? Well, curling ulcers are caused by burns because burns cause hypovolemic shock. Um, and it's really ischemia to the gut, to the stomach, that's causing those ulcers. So what that leads us is to a generalization. Well, okay, I guess if it's ischemia that's actually causing the ulcers, then it would follow that any type of shock is causing the ulcers. And then that's an opportunity to say, okay, well, what do I know about shock? How comfortable am I about shock? So it's sort of starting with those basic concepts, or it's kind of basic facts from first aid and associations, asking yourself why, and then playing this game of kind of where does it lead you? And it's much easier to do this with another person. But that was kind of my approach. And I think that's honest. I'm not trying to plug myself here. But I think that's where a tutor can be really helpful. Because they can really help guide you through that process. So that's kind of a longish way to answer that question. Let's see. Okay, so those were both basically the same question. Well, I would say, in terms of your question, Kevon, first year I went to lecture. Second year I hated. I didn't go to lecture. Um, in terms of my day-to-day process of studying during the step exam itself, or just in general. Because to be totally honest, I feel like the way I really learned this material as well as I did was actually after I took the step exam and started teaching people. If I was to say that like any way, like any way you can actually have an opportunity to tutor or teach people, the better you're going to learn this material. In general, what would I do? I go to lecture for 3 hours, and then I basically spend the rest of the day studying. I don't know, maybe I would take 2 hours off to go on a run or something like that. But in general, I would try and find people to study with, and because I found that much easier for me to kind of like bounce ideas off of each other. Um, that's kind of how I did things. I didn't really do the Q bank until I was in dedicated. I didn't even really know about the Q banks until dedicated. Okay, so this was a bit of an experiment, a bit of a test session. I think it started off a little rougher than I'd hoped. Definitely, you guys participating, asking questions was helpful. Something I'm thinking about doing is maybe having, like, what I really know is kind of how to teach this stuff. So like the content. So if people are interested, I'd be more than happy to maybe once a week do kind of regular content sessions, where I talk about cardiology or things like that. Um, what are people's thoughts on that? Would people be interested? Okay. Well, I'll probably hold one then at the same time next week, and I'd probably talk about cardiology and kind of how I approach cardiology, think about shock, things along those lines, um, and we can go from there. But hopefully this was helpful, and hopefully I'll see you guys next week. Yeah, yeah, sure. You can ask the last question. If you're still building your foundation, I don't know how useful it is. Um, I don't know how useful it is to do an NBME. I would spend kind of most of your time just building foundation. I think 7 months away, you have to be really careful about burnout. And just kind of getting exhausted. I actually think this is where like Anki and just kind of getting an overall like your specific kind of studying strategy is going to be very different than the American medical students. Um, uh, and so I don't know how much I take advice about from American medical students or like those study strategies. What I recommend first, because I've worked with several IMGs, what I'd recommend first is one, just spending time building a content, like finding good resources that can kind of step you through what you need to know. Um, I think that's where like maybe like Boards and Beyond, things like that can be really helpful. Um, so I would start maybe with like biochem. I know a lot of IMG programs they don't have as much biochem. Um, that's probably where I'd start. Um, I think Anki can be really helpful. I do think doing question banks, not randomized. I would start like this is actually what I'd start with is RX in this case. For you, I would start with RX, USMLE RX. USMLE RX is pretty much first aid in question form. And so that's where I'd start. I would not, and I would do that untimed, on tutor mode. It is a learning tool. Um, I would not recommend doing UWorld yet. You want to save UWorld for dedicated. You want to save UWorld when you're much more comfortable with the exam. Does that help answer your question? Perfect. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and end the stream. But hopefully this was helpful to you guys. And yeah, feel free to PM me for any questions over Reddit. And let's see. And I'll hold a cardiology session next week if enough people are interested. All right, take care.